Okay, Michael. Spotlight for everyone. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Let me see. Let me get everyone here. So I have a request. If you are not on the panel, can you exit and come back in 2 minutes so I can get the panel people in spotlight mode? Thank you. So if you're not on the panel, please come back in 2 minutes. Here's Gad. And let's see.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, for a little bit.
Gad can be unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Gad. And Curt, I'm in spotlight. Okay. Hi, Dennis Hayes. Nice to see you finally.
Hi, Pat.
I'm going to have to ask you to leave temporarily.
Okay, fine.
Here is Jordan. Jordan is in the spotlight as usual.
Hello, hello, testing.
Now then, again, if you're not in the panel discussion, I ask that you turn off your Zoom. Let's see, then we have Gad should be in the spotlight.
I'm not.
Now you are.
Oh, look at me. All right, good.
All your glory. Michael should be in the spotlight. And Michael's now in the spotlight.
All right.
And we have Janice we're looking for in the spotlight. Aha. Now we have Barbara somewhere. Barbara's here, and we are good to go.
Am I in the spotlight?
Yeah. Hi, Janice.
Hey, Barb.
Hi, Janice.
Hi there, Michael.
And let's see, we are in fact recording this. It would be horrible if we were not. So yes, this is absent-minded professor syndrome. Bear with me, people. Technically, I'm a chemical physicist. I should be able to do all this, but people generally do the work for me. So this is my first foray into all of this. So I want to say, first of all, welcome everyone to the very first SAFS panel discussion and event. So thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you all here.
Great pleasure to be
Hi there.
here.
Thank you.
Now,
Likewise.
I think perhaps we can go at this, since this is the very first experimental version of our event. What we can do is try and see how it goes in a few different ways and iterate as we go along and do a few audibles as they do in football. So what I propose is that I'll begin by asking each of you a different question. I'll have a primary and a secondary and a tertiary, so we could nucleate a discussion. And then at that point, we can all go about and have more of an informal free-for-all discussion. I think it would be easier to do such a thing if we were in a live auditorium on a stage, but because of the Zoom format, we'll have to find a way to make sure we have a nice rhythm to things. So the first thing I want to do for all the viewers, whether they're on the Zoom session or whether they're on YouTube later, is to introduce the panel and introduce the reason why we're here, Curt Jaimungal, the filmmaker, and introduce our little organization here. The SAFS is the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship at McGill. And we formed in the last year or so, and I think our name might even be a bit of a misnomer. Our objective is not necessarily to purely focus on academic scholarship in any dry way, nor in some historic sense that might pit scholars looking for free speech versus students looking for protection. What we see is that there are some fundamental cultural issues taking place at university, that university often gives rise to propagation of those issues, as many of our speakers have very eloquently noted in the last several years. What I hope is with this organization, we could begin to nucleate a discussion group for a wide variety of people, from professors to students, to staff, to donors, to civilians, to whoever might be interested, to the construction worker who's a taxpayer. We hope that people could tell us why they think that universities are doing well or not well, and things they might hope to see differently take place. So with that, I think that's our SAFS organization, briefly told. Now, I wanted to say the reason that we're here, first of all, is because of a recent film that I saw by our filmmaker, Curt Jaimungal, who has produced the documentary film that we screened earlier, Better Left Unsaid. I'm sorry we weren't able to finish it, due to the technical difficulties that I had created. Nonetheless, one of our guests had been able to solve those technical difficulties, and I think the majority of the film had been seen. Now, if you haven't seen the film, I strongly, strongly encourage you to do so. It is not merely a film about the failures of communism, as you might think for some of the footage or this last half of the film. It is a film that demonstrates how the same ideas that gave rise to Curt's movie and discussion of communism. We see a lot of parallels and isomorphisms taking place in the West and within academia, and our hope is to be able to protect these things. So I'd like to begin by introducing our speakers and then having themselves tell a little bit about themselves and why we're here. And I'd like to begin actually in an order of events, because I have sort of a personal connection to this. My name is Pat Kambhampati, if I've not mentioned it already, and I'm a professor of chemical physics here at McGill University. And you might ask, why is a professor of chemical physics interested in these social issues? And the answer is the same reason you are as civilians and taxpayers. But the thing is, what we see now is a lot of people are interested in how science is done, and we as scientists have some interest as well. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here. Along the way, as a civilian, I began to read the work of a lot of the people that you're seeing here on today's panel. The first person that I encountered in my sequence of events as a quantum mechanic, I like to think of the sequence of events, was I saw Janice Fiamengo. I think it was at Ottawa U or Queen's University. And I think it was something like, what does equality have to do with it, was her very first public speech in around 2013. And I remember that was the time that it was the first time that people started to riot at universities. In 2014, it became commonplace. But Janice's simple questions and amazing rhetoric and bravery and courage in that moment showed to me that there could be a better way to think, and we as professors could offer some value beyond just teaching our courses. I next encountered Barbara Kay in my readings as Janice had opened my eyes up, and I saw Barbara Kay in 2014 writing about things that people normally aren't able to write about. I saw her writing about the suffering of a man who was a tough guy, maybe a trucker or a blue collar worker who had been domestically abused and killed himself because he couldn't get any service. And I remember thinking this addresses so many of the questions that I had when I was a kid, and many of the people who would say, just stop asking these difficult questions. Barbara Kay was asking the difficult questions that a reporter does at the highest level. And since then, I've been finding her to do so on many levels, from politics to culture to academia. She has a new book out now that I think she'll tell you about. And I think that Barbara has been doing some of the most extraordinary political commentary I've seen, and that my eyes were open to her in, I think, 2014. Then I saw a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who is in the audience here, told me about this psychologist at Toronto by the name of Peterson that you'd like. And so this was before Bill C-16 came out, I believe it's called. I'm not much of a detail for these sort of little things, but I remember finding your videos thinking, this is fantastic. You're talking about how religion is suffering. And as an atheist, former Hindu, I understand these ideas. And I think that Jordan's bringing these ideas in some of the most eloquent and articulate ways that I think the millennials need to hear about. So I saw, thank goodness for Jordan Peterson. Then Bill C-16 came out, and then the rest is history. Now we all know Jordan. So that's about when I saw Jordan, right before Bill C-16. And then right about then I saw Gad doing the same sort of thing, except Gad's stylings, I would say I found quite different. Jordan's stylings I found very similar to my invocations of an atheist studying religion. Gad's parallelism I found is like he's the Ricky Gervais of academics and evolutionary psychology, and we need him. I've had people high up tell me now is not the time for you to be George Carlin, Pat. Others have told me, well, maybe it is. Maybe it's a time we need Ricky Gervais. And I think Gad for bringing a much needed vision of clarity to academia when we are masters of obfuscation. And finally, I encountered Michael Rectenwald, not because of Twitter, which I eschew. I won't make my value judgments here, but I heard about him by searching around for this person called the anti-PC NYU professor. And I thought this guy is really onto something here. He's been doing on a much broader scale what I'd been doing myself occasionally on Facebook, just as a civilian. He himself was a civilian, just saying, I want to be a person bringing out ideas, classical liberal ideas, again, to the academy. And Michael was in fact he had seen some of the most intense personal attacks of anyone in academics that I've seen. So to his credit, Michael continued to write bravely and has now left NYU to continue focusing on writing. His book, Springtime for Snowflakes, I have on my shelf, and I'll give to my I'll give to my high school kids once they reach university age. I say to Michael, I like his own stylings as well. Michael reminds me as an old 1970s punk rock fan like Sex Pistols and Ramones. I think of Michael Rectenwald as the academic version of one of those fellows. I think they would love you, and I think they'd have a good time chatting with you as well. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Let me begin by having our first guest here, as I went through in a chronological order. Janice, tell us why you're here under the auspices of the terms heterodoxy and dissidence. John Haidt has told us about heterodoxy. What is it that brings Janice Fiamengo here instead of teaching us about English?
Well, on the one hand, I'm not a dissident, I don't think. I'm an introvert who spent my entire youth reading novels and wanting to be an English teacher because I loved stories and I loved talking about stories and what they meant and language and why it was powerful. And I wanted to share that with people. So in one sense, then, I'm really not a dissident at all. And I didn't consider myself a political person in any way until I was in my late 20s as a result of graduate school. But now, yes, I do see myself as a dissident. I'm a dissident against the dour, joyless, repressive, totalitarian mindset that seems to have taken over so much of academia and so much of the wider culture. I see myself as an individual. I do not see myself as identified with a particular group. As a woman, I am not angry at men. I do not get my moral status from my position as an innocent victim. As a white person, I am not ashamed of being white. And I am so tired of the reductiveness of the discourse that now passes for elite opinion in so many spheres of our society.
Wonderful. Thank you, Janice. Barbara, tell us why you're here. Tell us why you are not just reporting on the usual politics and the usual guns versus butter discussion that a columnist might cover.
Thanks for inviting me, by the way. I'm very honored to be with the other members of this panel, all of whom I admire greatly. And I think I'm the oldest person on this panel. And I grew up in a period of time when classical liberalism was the prevailing, I wouldn't even call it a doctrine, it was a perspective. And we thought that was it. You couldn't get better than that. I don't think anybody has gotten better than that. And I benefited from that prevailing mood because when I went to university, I went during the golden age of university expansion here. I was there in the early 60s before the countercultural revolution. All my teachers were men, except one classics professor, a woman. It never occurred to me that I wasn't seeing people like me, you know. There weren't a lot of women in the university at that time, but that didn't strike me as something, I don't know. I didn't have any of the feelings I was supposed to have to become a feminist, and I did not become a feminist. I had a wonderful university education. I don't know what any of my professors' political philosophy was because it was never discussed. I too went through English language and literature because I love literature. But instead of going into teaching, I did go into teaching on a part-time kind of basis simply because it was the easiest thing to do. But found my real vocation quite late in life in polemical writing. And I started out defending men and boys, and then I found out what cults are like through fighting with the Pitbull advocacy movement and learned the truth of Marshall McLuhan's saying, if I didn't believe it, I wouldn't see it. So, and it evolved from there. And Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Now, Jordan Peterson, this is my first time interacting with you outside of email, so it's a pleasure to finally be able to meet you. I have to say, I saw some of your videos, not many. I spend most of my time living in my old little laboratory world, but what I say when I hear Jordan Peterson, he's someone who's bringing people like me and my colleagues out to the civilians. And I thank goodness for people like Jordan telling about people like us who are trying to clean up our rooms and clean up the world in the process. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done. And tell us about yourself. We know so much, but here's maybe the simple question that I would have. Why is it, as for others, that you're not in the faculty club with your friends? Why are you doing what you're doing? Oh, I think you must be muted, Jordan.
You're muted.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know what happened. Okay, sorry. Anyways, well, I'm very interested in identity, group identity, political identity, religious identity. That's been the central focus of my study. I've studied many topics as an academic researcher, but that was dearest to my heart. And I was always fascinated by people's willingness to put everything on the line for what they believed. And so I got interested in the relationship between belief and emotional regulation, let's say. And well, and then when I saw, I guess when Bill C-16 popped onto the horizon, there was something about it that just didn't sit right with me. And to begin with, I thought it was just about free speech because I believed that the bill required compelled speech, and I still believe that to be the case. And I think there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever for politicians to ever move politics into the domain of the regulation of speech in a compelled manner. That's a no-go zone as far as I'm concerned. They've crossed the line. And so, but then later I started to realize too that I wasn't very fond of the implicit theory of identity that was a part and parcel of Bill C-16. And I had read a lot about a lot of the background documents that went into the formulation of that bill. And I decided one day to make a YouTube video and say, look, here's what I think's going on. And I don't think it's good. And well, yeah, I went downstairs. I told my wife, I said, I'm going to make a YouTube video. I'm going to see what happens. It's like famous last words. So in any case, you know, I think I have some facility to see what's coming around the corner in some sense culturally. And that's what I was trying to warn about. And I don't know, it seems to me that things ended up going in the direction I thought they might. You know, it's hard when you're in a bubble, everybody's in a bubble and you select your own information. It's hard to tell how in touch you are with the real world. But I think the things that I was pointing to, the things that Janice was really pointing to at the same time, have come true with a vengeance, and it's not good. So that's why I'm in this discussion.
Thank you, Jordan. And I think, interestingly, the point of where you find yourself as having been poised by your academic work and your background to stand up for principle. The problem came to you. You weren't looking for a fight. A fight came to you. A fight came to Tiananmen Tank Man. And I think Jordan, Janice, Michael, Gad, I think, you know, Barbara, you've all been there taking those sort of stands, showing spines, and that's one of the reasons why you're here. Not because we agree or disagree, and I hope that we actually don't agree upon very much, because then we could have a more spirited discussion and we could learn from each other. But I think all of you are here for these spineful moments. So I don't know if that's a word, but I just made it up. So thank you, Jordan. Gad, I would say, in some ways reminds me most of myself, and I hate to imbue myself into here as the interviewer, but in this case, we all know Gad's story coming from Lebanon, and myself as a scientist in Montreal. I have a lot of friends in Lebanon, and we have a lot of scientists coming over back and forth between Montreal and Lebanon, so I'm quite familiar with the story, and Gad can tell you more about his story, which most of the viewers are familiar with. But Gad also has this remarkable sense of humor that one often finds from people who have, I think, gone through unusual circumstances. So I think with that, Gad Saad, tell us about why you're here. Tell us about why you're not in the faculty club. Maybe you are. I actually met you in the faculty club. I brought you over to the faculty club first to have a meeting over lunch, and I thought this is fantastic. So we met in the faculty club, in fact. But why are we not in the faculty club?
Well, thank you, Pat, for having us all here. And thank you, Curt, for being the reason that we're all here. Thank you for your film, and to all my co-panelists. So as Pat said, I grew up in Lebanon. And so I tell that story because it allows me to contextualize why I am in this fight. I always tell people that I faced two great wars in my life. The first great war was the brutality of the Lebanese Civil War, where I got to see what happens to a society when it instantiates a perfect form of identity politics, as is the case in Lebanon. And then the second great war I faced is once I became an academic and I saw the war on reason. And at first, I saw it really in my academic work, because for those of you who may not be familiar with my scientific work, I apply evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology in the behavioral sciences in general and in consumer behavior in particular. And that was considered completely heretical. How dare you say that human beings are shaped by biological forces? How dare you say that the same forces that shape the behavior of the mosquito and the zebra and the dog might shape the behaviors of consumers? You must be some heretic. And so I first saw the reflex of that people had when they felt that their pet ideologies were attacked. And as a evolutionary behavioral scientist, there's almost no pet ideology that is not triggered by evolutionary theory. And that's why I became so intimately familiar with all of the bad ideas that many of us are familiar with, whether it be social constructivism or biophobia or cultural relativism or postmodernism. Those are all fights that I first had in my academic career before it became part of the public discourse. And so I simply took the fights that I was already having in peer-reviewed journal and expanded them to a wider platform, the public at large. And so that's how I became who I am in the public sphere.
Well, thank you, Gad, for all the work that you do publicly. And I think we might have discussed that not everyone in the university appreciates the outreach work that you do, and that many of us does. I mean, Jordan, now this is your full-time job, and Michael, it's your full-time job. But Gad, you're still a professor, and bless you for being able to do this. And I think hopefully more professors will take up this mantle. I try to do it as much as I can, while trying to run a lab, and this is the reason why we're here. So thank you, Gad, for doing the work that you do, for bringing forth reason, not just in the faculty club or to our classes, but to the broader society. That's, I think, something we can do of value to society. So thank you for doing that. Now, Michael, I have to say, I've loved your writings on the anti-PC NYU prof Twitter feed. I only go on Twitter to see the occasional, great person. And that's where I saw Michael there. I found his book, Springtime for Snowflakes. I didn't get the second one, something about the Gulag Archipelago. I think that's what it's called.
Google Archipelago.
Google Archipelago. And of course, that's right. And so you're actually out now fighting with two swords, not just one. You're out of the academy and you are jousting. Tell us why. And you're jousting having come from the formal academic left to telling us how it works. So how did this come to play?
Well, that's a good question. I was trained in this literary and cultural theory. I studied in my PhD studies, I studied postmodern theory, I studied critical theory. So I was raised in this discourse. And, so you would have thought that I'd be one of the acolytes of it. But when I saw what was happening in the universities across the country and across North America, in fact, I became quite alarmed. I think it was exactly around the same time as Jordan Peterson was noticing what was happening with the pronoun wars in Canada. I started to see the institution of bias reporting hotlines and safe spaces, trigger warnings, all the no platforming of speakers going on. And I decided to speak out. And at this time, I was a leftist. I was actually a left communist, as it were. And nevertheless, when I spoke out against these things, I was interviewed by the student newspaper at NYU. Within 2 days of this interview appearing, I was called into the dean's office basically pressured into a leave of absence. And then I was condemned by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion group, which I've since dubbed the Conformity, Inequity, and Exclusion group. Basically, I was pushed into a corner. They moved my office to the Russian department from my own department. I like to say that they put me in my own personal gulag, in effect. They wouldn't ship my books. I was in a room with bare metal shelves and no staff, and basically they ostracized me entirely. And finally, it was just an untenable situation. So I effectively sued. I sued 5 colleagues for defamation because they lambasted me in this series of emails in which they were calling me a racist and a sexist while they spewed racist and sexist epithets at me. And they suffered no punishment. Instead, I was pushed out into the Russian department, and I decided to sue them and finally settled and took a retirement package because it was an untenable situation. Since then, I've been writing. I wrote Springtime for Snowflakes while still there. I wrote Google Archipelago since then. I wrote Beyond Woke as well, and a 4th book called Thought Criminal. So I have been pretty heavy involved in fighting this battle on the outside of the academy, but looking back in, it looks like atrocious. It's gotten even worse. I thought it would get worse, and it's just out of control at this point. I see nothing but this social justice wokeness shot through everything, with critical race theory running the show. It's just really alarming.
Thank you, Michael. And I have to say thank you for all the work that you're doing. The writing that you're doing is absolutely fantastic, and the speaking that you're doing is essential. And I think we forget that the university connects to the broader society in many ways. Our group sees that our academia gives rise to much of culture, and much of the culture that we'll discuss over the course of this panel, and much of the culture that Curt discussed in his film. But some of the things we can do is direct interaction, as you, Gad, Jordan, and Janice are doing. You're directly interacting with the civilians, saying, hey, not all professors are SJW advocates. We're all not part of
the employed ones.
Sorry, Jordan?
Just the employed ones.
Yes. So we can at least try to say there are others of us who think differently. We are heterodox, to use the phrase of Jonathan Haidt, and we might have more in common with the average civilian taxpayer than we do with our colleagues in grievance studies. Let's make that question known. So last and certainly not least is the person that brings us all together, Curt Jaimungal. You are a young filmmaker. Is this your first film or your second film?
This is my second film. Can you hear me? And also,
Yep.
do you mind switching the camera, because I had to log in from a different computer. This one right here is not working.
Okay.
You'll see that I'm joined twice. Can you switch it to the other one?
Switch it to the other one?
Please.
It might be impossible to do that because now we have so many people.
If you can't do it, then you can hear me fine, correct?
We can see you and hear you.
All
right, okay.
Here, I found you. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so do you mind repeating the question, Pat?
No.
Oh, now he's alone. You're the only one on Spotlight now.
No.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, Pat, do you mind repeating the question, please?
Yes. Well, we'll go with it this way for a while. So the question as we proceed here is, what brings you as an individual to this panel discussion? You might be doing any number of things, and here you are, you're probably a millennial yourself, and we talk about the views of the millennials, yet you're raising some of the most significant questions that are well packaged. So what brings you here?
Well, firstly, what brings me here is the perverse persistence of you, Pat. So thank you for that. And as for, well, I started this film because I'm a graduate of the University of Toronto. And so it's this whole extreme left, I don't want to call it ideology, but the set of ideas is deeply something that I have been affected by. And I also am an analytical person. And so these ideas of of the philosophies of the extreme left are extremely abstract and nuanced. So that's interesting to me as someone who likes to play with ideas more so than the extreme far right. And I find it such an unfair criticism sometimes I hear of the movie. Why are you analyzing the extreme left and not the far right? And that's one of the reasons, is that it's fairly easy to state what the far right stands for. And it's blunt and obvious. I'm a part of me is ashamed to be here too, because I see the film's flaws as being so close, because I'm so close to it. I just see blemishes and so on. But
Great film.
well,
Yes,
thank you
very
so much.
intense, very
I
intense.
appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you
It's
so much.
nicely edited too.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Well,
There's
that's
nothing
why
to
I'm
be
here.
ashamed of. Every
That's for sure.
creative product is flawed.
Right.
But that doesn't stop you from moving forward and getting better.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I had to come out at some point. Okay, well, that's why I'm here. And if I seem nervous, it's because I am. My bladder immediately shrinks, and I may have to shut it off quickly just to urinate and then come right back.
This falls under the too much information tenet.
Okay, with that, we move onwards. So I've taken the liberty of coming up with a set of questions. I don't think with this panel we need a set of questions. And I have to say, this is a great pleasure of mine. I grew up loving Charlie Rose as a young man in grad school. I'd come back late at night in the 90s and watch Charlie Rose, and in my 20s. So this is ridiculous. I just love the classic conversation, that meandering conversation that you might have between Wynton Marsalis and maybe Jordan Peterson, for that matter. So I love these sort of high bandwidth conversations as a kid. And I heard about this thing called Dick Cavett, and even before that, something called David Susskind, and all these things now I find on YouTube, which are these fantastic discussions that they don't have anymore nowadays. But guess what? They have them on YouTube. And you all venture into these sort of categories yourselves. Joe Rogan's become famous for offering what no one else does. And people seem to like that. People want to hear something more than a 5-minute answer. And people want to see how we are all heterodox in our own way. So with that, thank you all. Let's say here's something that I found in the film. I'll put you on the spot once more, Curt, and then I'll let you off the hook. I've seen the movie now 2 or 3 times, and I thought on the second viewing, there was a great question that the narrator asked. Why are you learning about this being communist atrocities, from an indie documentary? This question is both deep and connects significantly to modern times. Please explain why and how.
Can I add something to that, just
Sure.
for the sake of discussion? I taught about what happened in the Soviet Union and Maoist China in my second-year personality class, and it was the first time that my students had ever heard about it. And I taught it as a part of a section on existentialism, because I think of Solzhenitsyn as a great existential psychologist, essentially. But it was just absolutely shocking to me that the West went through a 40-year Cold War after the Second World War because of the terrible specter of communism, which we're still threatened by with North Korea and communist China to a substantial degree, and that none of the students, literally none of them, well, perhaps there were a few, but it was stunning to me that none of that was taught. And I struggled to understand it. So it was good of you to highlight that, Curt. That was a smart move.
Well, thank you. Actually, I screened it for test audiences, and virtually none of them has heard of what happened on the extreme end of the left politically. Except one person who was a history major, and he said, "Isn't this obvious? You shouldn't even include that line because you're presupposing a certain set of knowledge on the audience." And I said, "It's not obvious." I actually started this documentary because I wanted to know about the connection between what happened in Mao's China and Soviet Russia, and even some of the modern philosophies of postmodern philosophy. And is there a connection? And is there a connection between the extreme left ideas of the past and that? Are they the modern iterations? And what about the subsequent bleakness and the torment that characterized those regimes. What's tricky is that it's extremely tricky, because whenever you're comparing any two items, there's manifold ways in which they're similar and dissimilar. And so anyone who wants to say that if I'm making an analogy, it's false because look at all these different factors that are happening now. And that's true. And so what I tried to make was an abstract case. I tried to abstract it out and say, this is what's in common between them all. And as for whether or not this concrete version of it today will be the same as what's happened before, I don't know. I make the case that it may, or likely may, but I don't know. So that's that.
Pat, can I link communism and
Please do,
Marxism?
Gad.
So one of the things that I teach my students, certainly my MBA students, when I'm teaching them about evolutionary psychology, is that to understand the evolutionary roots of human nature has real practical implications. In that, for example, if you have a product that you create that is contrary to, violates a central tenet of evolutionary bases, then it's going to fail. So if you take romance novels and you create an archetype of a male hero, but that archetype of the male hero is not what women fantasize about, then the product is going to fail. Well, take now Marxism and socialism and communism. They're political systems that are antithetical to fundamental tenets of human nature. That's exactly why I love to use the example of E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist who studied social ants. And when he famously was asked about socialism and communism, he said, great idea, wrong species. Because what he was pointing to there is that for social ants, where they're all equal, other than the queen, who is bestowed with the responsibility of having the reproductive objectives, everyone else is equal. So for social ants, communism is great. For humans, it's not so great because it violates many tenets of our innate human repertoire of preferences and behaviors. And so to understand these political systems from an evolutionary lens allows us to finally come to the conclusion, despite the fact that we have tons of empirical evidence, as Curt has pointed to in his great film, where he looked at all of those different examples where it has been tried, and where typically the rebuttal is, no, but bruh, that's not real socialism. That's not true social, right? Well, you could try it another 17,000 times, and I can promise you, I know what the result is going to be, because human nature is what it is, and you can't fit that political system with human nature. So that's one way by which a lot of my evolutionary work can certainly fit very nicely with a lot of the conversation we're having here.
Fascinating. Barbara, I wanted to ask you
about
something.
Sorry, Gad.
Oh, sorry. Let me ask Barbara this.
Yes.
In your view, being plugged into education and culture and broader culture, as opposed to us in our little ivory tower, why is it we're learning about communism and the atrocities of the left from Curt's film?
Oh, I think because we're under the prevailing zeitgeist that is extremely far left itself. They do not see, it's very interesting. I have some progressive friends. And because I'm Jewish, we're always talking about anti-Semitism and where it comes from. And right now is a difficult time because there's plenty of it about, and it's growing, and there's no question it's a global phenomenon that is reviving again with the same kind of ferocity we used to see a long time ago, and that we thought that the Holocaust had ended forever, but it only put a pause on it. It's back. But most of my progressive friends think that it's all about the far right. That's the problem. And they talk about the neo-Nazis and QAnon and how horrible it is, and the democracy dying in darkness because of these far right, Trump supporting, deplorable, blah, blah, blah. And I said, do you seriously think that is the biggest threat to democracy? Are these people that have no institutional power whatsoever, that everybody hates, even conservatives, most of them can't stand these people, and that, a few lone wolves have perpetrated some murderous crimes, obviously deplorable and terrible. But when you see who's in charge of teaching our young people, who's in charge of making up rules about gender teaching in schools, who's running the foundations, who's running everything, the media and everything else, it's the left, and their philosophy is pretty pernicious right now. Identity politics is terrible. Critical race theory is terrible. Yeah. There's a lot I don't like about that, they say, but they're not the ones that are, that want to kill Jews. I said it. Anyways, it's very hard to have this discussion with people who are so, that really do not see how dangerous the left is. They see, yeah, I don't agree with that. I think it's gone too far. I think that they have no concept of how blocked any other point of view is. And so it's very difficult to have that conversation with them. It's very frustrating. So that's why they don't learn about it. And Jordan, you said once, and it was very true, you said, everybody knows what the end result is of the far right. It's Auschwitz. But when you ask somebody what's the worst that can happen on the far left, they look at you, they're stumped, because they don't know. They don't know.
It's going to turn into a giant love-in.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, but even if you said, what if the far left went too far? What would that end in? And they don't say the Gulag or a
100 million
massacre, Pol
people
Pot
killed.
massacre, or the cultural revolution, or 100 million people dead. Like they will never tell you that, and because they don't know it and they don't know the history, they are ignorant of the true history of the depredations of communism. And so it's very hard to have any serious conversation with somebody who has drunk the Kool-Aid of the left as basically motivated by social justice, compassion, and it's always, these systems are always based in compassion, right? They don't see that utopianism. Utopianism is a pernicious concept in itself, or a guiding principle. And that is the problem with the far left, and one that most, even quite educated people, do not grasp.
Thank you, Barbara. As you've mentioned this, it actually connects to a lot of my background growing up as an Indian, in which my extended family were Indian communists, because the Communist Party was very central to Indian development, both during the Cold War, but also Gandhi was a socialist communist. I think you used the word, what was the word that you used? Someone who has a true believer of some form. I forgot the word that you used.
Who, me?
You had just used the correct term, Barbara, I was thinking of, to describe what I would call Gandhi, a believer of some form.
Yes, a true believer. Well, I mean,
True
yeah,
believer.
the acolytes and they are true believers. Yeah.
And so my grandparents themselves were acolytes of Gandhi in the early days, became communists as they were then as young people, renounced communism actually, and in the process of renouncing communism, lost many of their social connections and much social standing, because the Communist Party still had a lot of sway in India, and you still lose a lot of your social connections when you say, sorry, I guess it was a good idea at the time when I was a kid, but now I realize, oops, and thankfully it didn't take. But there was this battle in India between the more communist leaning Gandhian types, who are the head in the clouds types, and then the more practical Nehru types, who were like trying to create a government, trying to create democracy. And luckily government and democracy won, as opposed to the communist side. But that does bear in mind with much of my history. And I grew up sympathizing, if not empathizing, with communism, thinking you're just trying to help out the poor person. Now I realize, as Ronald Reagan correctly said, I as an old punk rock kid, I can say he was correct about one thing: it is an evil empire. So I'm glad that we're now beginning to recognize these things. And I did something I didn't understand as a young person myself. Haven't grown up, not that I grew up in India, but haven't been exposed to that in India. Michael, I wanted to ask you something. This is, I think, something that would be a particular question for you in much of your writing. Social justice. Social justice sounds like a great idea, and Curt discusses the idea of social justice in his film. Can you tell us, in your view, about the history of social justice, and can you contrast it with the more traditional ideas of justice and principles? Interestingly, I would recall, I add a note to the readers, I'm sure you recognize this, that social justice was actually the name of the truly racist white nationalist magazine in the 1940s. Not everyone knows that, but you can still see those actually in old bookstores. Please tell us what you think about social justice.
Well, it's a phrase that has no intrinsic meaning, but there's a very interesting history to it. It was actually originally used by a conservative Jesuit in 1840s. He coined the term social justice, and it was really it first referred to a conservative theory that recognized hierarchies, that had no demand for de facto equality, and in fact became part of the Catholic doctrine and was disseminated by the Pope. But then, of course, social justice got picked up by secular philosophy, and it became important to John Rawls, who developed an essentially socialist social justice, which means basically economic equality. But today's social justice, it borrows from Maoism, the techniques from Maoism like struggle sessions and auto-critique, and it borrows from postmodern theory. And I'll talk about that later if we get to postmodern theory. But intersectionality is like the axiomatic oppression ranking framework that establishes this new social justice hierarchy based on how many vectors of oppression you have intersecting you. You are so in such a place on the totem pole, but the totem pole gets flipped upside down because it's an inverse hierarchy. Social justice means to debunk people from the top of the social hierarchy and put them on the bottom, and to flip the totem pole on its head. So it's not egalitarian at all. It aims to actually establish a new hierarchy. And it does this through this inversion, and then it has to maintain this kind of animus in order to continue fueling the movement. There's never a satisfaction that, well, white men are finally debunked. We finally knocked them down. No, it goes on and on. This is an endless stream of vitriol that is directed at the so-called, oppressors and in favor of the so-called subordinate. But, as it turns out, the so-called subordinates are not subordinate at all. They're actually running the show. So, and they're doing so from a very authoritarian, totalitarian vantage point. They're not at all egalitarian whatsoever. So my opinion about social justice is the biggest misnomer in the 20th and 21st century.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Janice, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say first just that, Curt, when I hear you talking about the flaws of the film, I shake my head, because really it is, I don't think it can be overstated what a powerful film it is. And I when I was rewatching it and preparing for this discussion, I was thinking, well, I don't really have anything more to say. It's really there in that film. Extremely eloquently said. All of the connections.
Janice. You're too kind. Thank you.
And you've even got, no, I'm not really. I mean, you've even got a little bit of postmodern self-reflexivity in there, critiquing yourself, second guessing yourself a little bit. I think it's wonderful. And I especially appreciate, I think, how, you start off by drawing together all the threads of the kinds of discussions, the kinds of claims that are being made in our contemporary society, the moral positions that are being taken up. And then you make that connection between the desire to put people into groups and the tendency that as soon as one establishes these oppressor groups and oppressed groups, then when you are speaking supposedly on behalf of the oppressed, you can do nearly anything. Once you've established the intolerable injustice that is being perpetrated by the oppressor group, there is no limit to which one cannot go and claim moral righteousness in going, so long as one claims to be acting on behalf of the oppressed. And I think, that is the key insight in your film, and it's very beautifully and very powerfully expressed. One thing, I have lots of things to say about social justice. Obviously, our idea of justice is that justice is blind, that each person has equality before the law. I mean, none of that is of any interest to the proponents of social justice. They're interested in group membership, and really they're interested in vengeance against the alleged oppressor. And they use terms now like restorative justice, or what's the term now? I just came across compensatory justice. I just came across an essay in a journal called the Boston Journal. It's by two alleged health practitioners who are applying critical race theory to the practice of medicine. And they are advocating, and not even just advocating, they are part of a pilot project that is underway, I think right now, or is about to begin at a Boston cardiac hospital. And it will instruct healthcare deliverers to treat patients differentially on the basis of race, so that Hispanic and Black cardiac patients will be treated differently from other patients, supposedly to redress health inequities that have been in place, you know, for a very long time. And they use terms like redistributive justice, compensatory justice in healthcare. And so that is the kind of end that social justice warriors, woke doctors have in mind. And I guess the last thing I would say for now about social justice is that I'd like to pick up on Michael's notion of the animus that is so much there, though not admitted, in, you know, in the practice of these kinds of liberatory movements. And I think that maybe we make a mistake in always assuming that compassion is really at the bottom of these kinds of movements. I think, yes, there are people who feel deep compassion, but I also think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which rage and fury and murderous hatred really is at the bottom of much of these movements, because those feelings, they feel very good. And to be given a warrant to express murderous hatred, it's a very, very powerful thing. I experienced it in Take Back the Night marches, very briefly, I have to say, and it didn't withstand my encounter with real human beings in the classroom. But I remember marching in Take Back the Night marches and feeling that murderous, exhilarating rage. And I think it is a very powerful part of these kinds of movements.
Janice, let me briefly add to that. I'm really glad that you actually did mention the Take Back the Night, because I was one of those students for whom the night was taken, I guess, away from, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a freshman in Carleton College in Minnesota in 1988. Coincidentally, ironically, I met my wife there, the mother of my children we met, but it was, and she interestingly actually took back the night. But that was what many of her peers did, her sister did. And so many of our current family actually all went to the same place, in which there was this thing where young women took back the night. A small fraction of young men did. I know Gad Saad and Jordan Peterson have a theory for that, and we can talk about that later. And then the majority of other men were like, oh my God, myself, I remember thinking I was very sort of the typical stereotypical clueless Asian kid showing up to college or university. So I had this crazy impression that girls liked boys and boys liked girls. And then all of a sudden here it is in freshman week is Take Back the Night. And I said, okay, see you in 4 years. Good things for a drug, good things for a, you know, beer and rock and roll, because at least I'll keep myself busy with that. But I'm glad that you did mention Take Back the Night, because I would say this now, as a 50-year-old man, this is 30 years later, almost over 30 years later, I still talk to my college friends who still feel traumatized from that. Mm-hmm. And why? Because you get traumatized by things when you're a child. You don't get traumatized by things when you're an adult, which is something that I think any psychologist or psychiatrist would know. That's something that happens when you're young and you're in your formative years. So this is what happens to young men at university in their formative years.
Can I just add one thing about social justice?
Please.
From a Middle Eastern perspective? So in the Middle East, as some of you know, in Islamic countries, you have what's called Sharia law, right? Islamic law. Sharia in Arabic means the path, way, the street. So Sharia law is the, you know, the Islamic jurisprudence. A central tenet of Sharia law is that a the seriousness of a crime is determined by the identity of the perpetrator and of the victim. There's literally a exact calculus by which you say, okay, a Muslim man kills Jewish woman, this is the calculus. A Jewish man kills Muslim man, here's the calculus, right? So it is perfectly antithetical to everything that we would consider justice in the West when Janice was referring to, blind, justice should be blind and so on. When I think about the progressive calculus, it is identical to that calculus, right? If I am Black, I could say the N-word. If I'm not Black and I say the N-word, the punishment is different. When you're talking about CRT in the medical field, it's exactly that. If you are Black, you receive treatment first. In the Middle East, if you're non-Jew, you receive treatment first. So the structure of Sharia law is identical to so-called the progressive moral code. As someone who has escaped the Middle East, I can assure you that you don't want to be using Sharia law as your model for meting out a moral calculus.
Thank you, Gad. Now, continuing with social justice, I'm going to flip this next question to both Jordan and Gad, because it'll relate to psychology and how humans work. And I think we'll also ask Curt about this question because it relates to part of what he discusses in the film. To what extent is the current social justice movement taking place of religions? What are the similarities and differences between religions and modern SJW? What is the impact of the arrival of what I call a non-religious religion? Is there any precedence for this behavior in history? Jordan, what do you think?
Well, it was one of the things I liked about Curt's film is that he raised that as a possibility. So here, this is a question I wanted to put to the panel. So you may or may not know that Jean Piaget posited the existence of a messianic stage in human development. He didn't believe necessarily that it was a stage that everyone got to, but he identified it as essentially characteristic of late adolescence. So let's imagine that there's a period of time. This would also be the period of time when men are inducted into armies, because they have to be inducted somewhere between 16 and 20 for it to be particularly effective, that you need to be enculturated at that age. And in an intact culture, so to speak, that means the adoption of a religious belief that saturates the entire culture. Dance, music, literature, stories, cultural history, mythology, everything that's granted to you, and it gives you an identity, and that's what your identity is. Now, our culture has transformed itself with incredible rapidity over the last several hundred years, and we've fragmented that all up into bits. And we have these students who go to university with the messianic urge deeply embedded within them, and they're offered what's essentially a fragmentary religion. I mean, this is something I've made much of in my writings. And I think that every ideology that has a powerful motivational pull uses what's essentially religious language to carry forth it's a parasite, to use Gad's word. An ideology is a parasite on an underlying religious structure. And a proper religious structure gives you a balanced view of the world. There's characters for the negative part of nature. There's characters for the positive part of nature, for the negative part of culture, for the positive part of culture. It gives you a view that enables you to look at the world and its existential permanences, I guess, in a manner that allows you to live a balanced life. You get indoctrinated into an ideology, and you find where Satan is. It's not in you, it's out there in the patriarchal oppressor, let's say. And the thing about that is that it rings true mythologically, and it is also true because every culture is oppressive to some degree, and we're all crushed as individuals by the dictates of arbitrary society. And kids get into the university and they're taught this one-sided, lopsided doctrine with a utopian end, and it matches their developmental needs perfectly. And it's a totalizing theory, which is also extremely attractive because you can swallow 15 axioms and you can explain the entire world. And then to Janice's point, and this is something that I think people are extremely naive about. Many people that I talk to about, well, both the right and the left, the extremes on both, insist that people are almost always motivated by what they see as a higher good. And I'll give you just a quick example, and then I'll let Gad talk. When I debated Slavoj Žižek, I offered a critique of the Communist Manifesto. And I noted at one point to this audience of about a couple thousand people, many of whom were radical Marxists there to hear Žižek hypothetically defend Marxism, which he never really did. I said that the Communist Manifesto was an incitement to bloody mayhem and murder. And a good 25% of the crowd laughed and cheered in a Freudian slip moment, you know, revealing their true motivation. And the true motivation was exactly that. It's like vengefulness so deep that the essential desire is to see the goddamn system burn to the ground. And that's not motivated by the desire for the establishment of a utopia. Now, I wouldn't say that there's no one on the left who's motivated by positive motivations. Obviously there is, but that's not the point, is that there's something dark about this, that it's not just ignorance, it's willful blindness. And it is this desire, and there's a romantic desire there too, that Antifa, for example, capitalizes on, and so do the right-wing, dramatic right-wing organizations, you know, because young people in particular want to be involved in a dramatic cause and play out their heroism in the world. And we don't do a good job of offering them a manner in which they can do that. That's, let's say, pro-social. How about we put it that way? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jordan. Gad?
So I guess the way I'll tackle the question is to look at some of the cognitive structure similarities between religion and quasi-religion of SJWs. So in science, you have epistemic humility, right? So even if you have something as established as the theory of evolution, if tomorrow there were some compelling evidence that falsifies in an incontrovertible manner, evolutionary theory, well then, we'd have to go back to the drawing board. And so there are no revealed truths in science. Even when you have truths in science, as I think everybody in this panel would know, it's provisional truth, and that we're always open to being falsified. And of course, Karl Popper had his falsification principle, whereby he said, for something to be within the realm of science, there has to be a clear way by which we can falsify a given posited hypothesis. Well, the social justice warriors operate in exactly a contrary way epistemologically to everything that I just said, right? There are revealed truths, right? There is no way for me to reach a Muslim and tell him, here is some evidence that suggests that Muhammad could not have flown on winged horse to the moon. There is no way I could use that evidentiary mechanism to prove that my position is veridical and his is incorrect. By the same logic, there is no way to falsify myself out of the eventual appellation of me being a bigot. So let me give you an example of a Kafkaesque trap. So if I say that I am uniquely attracted to Black women because I love their bodies, I am a disgusting racist because I'm fetishizing their exoticism. If I say I'm uniquely unattracted to Black women, I am engaging in sexual racism. So if I am attracted to Black women, I'm a bigot. If I'm unattracted to Black women, I'm a bigot. I'll just apply it in one other context, but there are many others I could use. If I say I am unattracted to women that weigh 500 pounds, I'm engaging in fatism because overweight people deserve love, and I'm a bigot. If I say I'm uniquely attracted to large women, I'm fetishizing their fat folds. So I am a bigot no matter what I do. So since I can't falsify any position that you take, we are in the realm of the religious. So the cognitive structure of religion and SJWs is exactly the same. You just instantiate that religious fervor in different contexts, but it's the same impulse.
Thank you. And I have to say, as someone in the physical sciences, we now become subjects to this new religion. So it's become very frustrating. Myself and my colleagues, we talk about this constantly, where there was this world of separation of church and state. As an American, I think of that. Then we have, in the university at least, the separation of the Church of Social Justice from science. So the grievance studies people went about doing what they were doing since 1990, roughly. I don't know, maybe the 1980s. I think it might have started in the 1980s, the grievance studies people. Well, eventually they became so powerful. Now they are coming for us, the physical scientists, because we're public enemy number one. Why
No,
are
the
we
biologists are public enemy number one.
You're
You guys
actually
are probably second.
it's a fair question. The biologists are public enemy number one, and we'll get to this because they have implications upon human behavior, which is why people like Gad and Jordan get into so much trouble. I don't get into so much trouble because I literally get into fights with Russians at Los Alamos about the behavior of an individual electron, and we get into celebrity death matches about the behavior of an electron because who's got a better laser, and we do this, but the problem is we're mostly males who are Jewish or Asian. And I'm going to say that specifically because we're mostly males that are Jewish, that are Asian. And there's about, it's about 1/3 Jews, 1/3 Asian, 1/3 whites. And, then there's the 10% of the remainder here and there. But and that's true both in academia. I used to work at a fiber optic startup. And when I went to big fiber optic conferences, I realized that everyone had a brown head or a black head of hair just like me. And you can't make this stuff up. So anyway, people like us in physical science, we are now part of the enemy because we do what we do, and we do what we do at the periphery of the norms. As Jordan will say, we are 6 standard deviations from the norm, so you shouldn't judge the mean by the wings of the distribution. We're the wacko wings of the distribution, and they're trying to judge the norms of the distribution by our behavior, and we suffer for it. So that makes us...
Not as much as you're going to.
Yes. Yes. So
you the
the
scientists are so unprepared for this. Like they're just going to get mowed down. It's really something to see. They have no political sense whatsoever.
Jordan, I'm here to tell you, as a physical scientist, that's the case.
Yeah,
I've been trying to bring this thing together for 4 years now. In fact, I looked at my old emails, and finally we got it together. But most of my scientific colleagues ask me, why are you wasting your time doing this instead of improving your signal to noise? Yeah. You realize that in all the time you wasted on this, you could have got a factor of 10 improvement in your signal to noise, and they got another paper out of it.
Yeah, well, that's what makes them great physicists. They're obsessed with their specialty, as they should be. But
yes,
and that's what the universities were for, was to protect people like that, peculiar, odd, obsessed, people 6 standard deviations from the mean, who can bring benefit to the rest of us because of their absurd specialization. But now and then, the generalist beats the specialist, and now and then, and that's what's happening on the cultural landscape. And plus, you guys believe in objective reality, so you're not very popular because of that.
Can't have that. I was going to mention in one of these questions here that the story of Lev Landau, and the civilian might not know it, but Lev Landau was probably one of the half dozen smartest people of the century. He was a physicist in the Soviet Union, and he would have been even more famous, Nobelist, of course, but probably would have been a multi-Nobelist if he were in the United States. But in the Soviet Union, it's hard to get publicity. So at some point, as a young man, you look out on Wikipedia, there's a picture of Landau. He looks like one of the guys from Big Bang Theory. And, he just looks absolutely silly. He looks like a theoretical physicist. He looks like a genius. And he was almost sent to the gulags for this, for going around making jokes about comparing Stalin to Hitler. And you can't go around making jokes comparing Stalin to Hitler. So what happened is, so he didn't get sent off to the gulag, one of the higher ups at the Russian Academy of Sciences had himself saved. So now keep your mouth shut, get back to science, go win yourself a Nobel Prize, stop talking about Hitler and Stalin. But the fact is, there were Nazi scientists, there were communist scientists, and now there are social justice scientists who have to agree with the fact that gender is not a social construct. We have to go along with gender is not a social construct, despite the fact that we are actually...
is a social construct.
So anyway, they're coming for us. They're coming for us. Which brings us to a question that I'd like to ask Michael here, which is, again, related to the religious quality to our times. But in specific, academia has given rise to what I call isms, capital I isms. At the least, beginning with progressive racism in the 1800s. That was something I actually learned accidentally as a kid by looking at my grandfather's old bookshelf. But it turns out progressive racism was a thing in the 1800s, and something that I have liked to call by parallel progressive genderism in the 1900s. How do you view these academic isms? What is their impact upon society? If there are harms incurred, what protections can we devise? And again, this goes back to the story of Landau comparing Nazism and Stalinism, both isms.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to, I guess, the ism that, since Curt mentioned it in his film and we haven't really talked about it yet, is postmodernism. Let's take postmodernism, for example. Jacques Derrida, in his book of Grammatology, he asserted the following: there is nothing outside of the text. And so he was suggesting here that there is nothing but language. It has no correspondence to any object world. There's no objective correlative to anything we say. And therefore, truth is completely, impossible to attain. There's no objective, any chance of attaining anything like objectivity. And this is how we got to this idea of like my truth, right? My truth is asserted. It's possible to assert my truth because once you deny the objective world, you can then assert your own subjective truth as my truth, and nobody can argue with it. So this becomes like an epistemological solipsism where people are essentially encapsulated in their own truth claims with no correspondence to anybody else's, and we can't know their truth and we can't question their truth. And the problem with this is not simply that we have no criteria for truth claims with this kind of notion, but rather it leaves open the possibility that when it has the requisite power behind it, then anything can be asserted and can be asserted with force. And this is what's happening. This is how postmodernism is basically been the tool of the social justice warrior. It's kind of like I call social justice practical postmodernism. It's postmodernism in practice. They take these epistemological uncertainties and this nihilism in effect, then couple it with power, which is another principle of postmodernism, that truth is merely the most plausible thing that one can say inflected by power. So it's effectively power which brings about the truth, the validity of any statement whatsoever. And this leaves us open to the possibility that of authoritarianism. There's no pushback from the object world, and they can assert whatever they want with impunity, and coupled with the necessary force, we're then led to believe that we have to deny our senses when certain beliefs are posited as true and asserted and have force behind them, the force of the state. In the case of transgender theory, for example, the force of the state is behind it. And they can say that if you don't accept that your child is a boy or a girl when they are the other, then you could go to jail for this, or you could lose your child, or you could lose custody of your child. So when my truth becomes as good or better than any objective truth, then we get to this point where the requisite power is applied, and therefore we get the kind of authoritarianism and totalitarianism that we saw in the Soviet Union, where people were forced to maintain things they knew to be false. Deconstruction is therefore like it posed as liberatory in the 60s and 70s, but it really turns out to be a tool for totalitarians intent on imposing their will on other people. This is one of the main games of the authoritarian left, and it's of course spread from academia to society at large.
Thank you, Michael. Janice, tell us what you think.
Well, I won't say too much. Maybe, gee, that was very powerful, Michael. Of course, the ism that I've been most interested in over the last 10 years or so is intersectional feminism. And I guess responding to what Jordan said about what the university was once for. That it was this place for nerdy geniuses to pursue their passion and for the exploration of esoteric knowledge. And I mean, it's just so sad to think that I'd say that all of that has been entirely lost as a result of the invasion of isms. And of course, the university was never free of isms, but at least there was once the idea that was a worthy goal, that the university should be a place where the primary and the exclusive goal is the pursuit of knowledge, the disinterested pursuit of knowledge. Since, I guess, the late 60s, that has not even been seen as a worthy goal anymore. And certainly the feminist ideologues were one of the first major groups to invade the university in the early 1970s and to take it over in very quick time. And they, of course, were not at all interested in, they claimed that they were interested in studying women's experience, which nobody would object to, I don't think, but they weren't really interested in studying women's experience or studying the art that women made or whatever it happened to be. They were really interested in changing their society, and they quickly made that clear, that the whole purpose of women's studies and the whole purpose of feminist scholarship, and as it invaded all the disciplines, was to train up foot soldiers for the revolution. I was shocked, actually, when I started looking at women and gender and sexuality studies websites to see that that's clearly stated on nearly all of their websites. And to go back to my previous statement, a lot of what that involves is training students to hate. It reminds me of that line from a song in the musical South Pacific, that you have to be taught to hate and fear. And that's become one of the primary raison d'etres of women's studies and of all feminist scholarship, is to teach students to hate. And it's now so blatant, yet sort of generally accepted. We have people like Professor of Women's Studies and Sociology Susanna Walters, who writes an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" and continues in her position and teaches men and works alongside of men and makes decisions about men's grades and her colleagues' promotion and tenure and all sorts of things. When it's not an ironic title. She writes a crude, very mawkishly expressed editorial in which she says that men are rightly hated because they're responsible for everything bad in the world. And you have a professor like Professor Christine Fair, I think her name was, from Georgetown University, who tweeted out that all of those men who supported Brett Kavanaugh should be murdered and their bodies ground up and fed to pigs. And that goes on. You have a professor of Cambridge, Professor Gopal, I think, tweeting out last summer that white lives do not matter. And that's perfectly acceptable. There was a little bit of controversy, but Cambridge University stood up for her right to say so. Charles Nagy, on the other hand, at the University of Central Florida, who tweeted that Black privilege is real and explained what he meant. Well, he has since been fired from the university for going against the dogma of racist injustice. So it's startling to see, and unfortunately, the incitement to hatred against men in particular, and against white men, men in general, and white men in particular, perhaps, it doesn't stay in the university, of course. It spreads out into all spheres of society, especially into the sphere of law, where we see its poisonous fruit being manifested in changes to rape law, changes to the idea of consent that have atrocious impact on many, many ordinary men who are finding their lives turned upside down because they, failed to gain consent at every stage of a sexual encounter. I mean, there are all sorts of atrocious practices that stem from the activist insistence that women are always the innocent victims of male sexual predation. So it's really, it is extraordinary to think how much the university has changed, and even how much its own sense of itself has changed just in a few decades. Most universities would no longer say that the pursuit of truth is a primary objective. They would say that the pursuit of social justice, inclusion, diversity, and what's the other one? I've already forgotten. Equity, of course. You know, that these are
opposite of diversity,
which is the opposite of diversity, that these are competing or even more important goals in many cases. It's astounding, the success of the isms at taking over our universities.
You know, Janice, myself, like Curt, being mathematically and physically inclined, I like to categorize things in ways that my feelings don't matter. Your feelings don't matter, my feelings don't either. And I'm cool with that, as long as we're both cool with the fact that none of our feelings matter. It's just the data. So, for example, I'm not a biologist, but they categorize things in their own nice little way, and that tells us about the structure of plants and animals and how they're related and so forth. So we can do that for ideas as well. And so, for example, we do so for isms. One thing is, everyone likes this idea that racism means white people hating black people, as opposed to the practice of every neighbor hating everyone else's neighbor, regardless of the race, all over the world. That's the practice of little r racism. The practice of big R racism is, as the anthropologist would say, and our colleague Philip Salzman would tell us, racism was a progressive academic field between 1850 and 1920. And I think it was Franz Boas who finally put the nail in the coffin for racism. He gave rise to something else, but you know, things continue on their merry way. So why not?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Let me finish this thought, Gad, and then we can go to your comment as well. My question is this, or my comment is, why not genderism? You could be feminist, you could be a masculinist. So instead, why not categorize yourself by your ism? No one's a masculinist, but you can be a feminist. So to what extent is genderism an isomorphism to racism? What do you think, Janice?
I would certainly say it is, of course. You know, I mean, if professors of sociology can proudly declare that they hate men, I think she did follow it up, Professor Susanna Walters, by saying that she really only hated older white men. And then she also complained in a subsequent column that she had received a great deal of hate mail as a result for that article. You know, I mean, yes, you know, what's the difference between her declaring herself a racist and her declaring herself a woman who hates men with self-righteous self-regard?
I will say, my teenage sons, I can't influence their thoughts. They have the same question. I can't tell a difference between a racist and a genderist because they view it the same way. And they're teenage boys on the internet, on YouTube. They're actually learning about some of you on YouTube themselves on their own, which is fantastic. So Gad, tell us what you're thinking.
Barbara, I think you seem eager.
Okay, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Well, I'm just going to mention, since we're talking about isms, I thought I would mention 3 other isms that, I mean, Janice already spoke about feminism, but let me mention 3 other ones very briefly. So cultural relativism frees us from the onerous task of having to judge the other, right? Because we're all so empathetic and caring. So who are we to judge a culture that might cut off the clitorises of 5-year-old girls? You must be engaging in cultural annihilation of the other. So in this case, the ism is liberating me from the shackles of having to judge someone else. Social constructivism also liberates me from this pesky thing called reality, because what it does, it basically says we are all born with equal potentiality, and the only thing that could have acted on otherwise empty brains and equal potential is some sequence of socialization forces. So had it not been that my mother hugged me too much or too little, I could have been the next Michael Jordan. So in that sense, it liberates me from the shackles of my unique barriers to succeed. And then finally, one that probably you didn't think about when you were coming up with this question, Pat, the isms, is Islamism. Islamism frees me from having to frontally criticize Islam. So I create this mythical unicorn called Islamism, so I can critique Islamism. That's bad. Islam is gorgeous. Islamism is bad. But of course, for someone who understands these things, Islamism is almost entirely what Islam is. Most of Islam is political. Very little of Islam is spiritual. So Islamism is not something outside of Islam. It is what defines Islam. So each of these isms have one thing in common. They liberate us from something that is otherwise too pesky to attack frontally.
Thank you, Gad. Barbara?
What I was going to say, I just want to circle back a little bit to something you were talking about before, Pat. Well, one thing I wanted to say was that hatred that Janice has talked about, and this idea of rage, I think one of the things the way you can separate a good philosophy or a good religion or a good perspective on life is to ask yourself, is hatred of somebody else the unifying bond between the members of this group? And in all the cases, you know, feminism, and there's always a scapegoat, because utopians believe that the world could be a perfect place except for this one group that is stopping the world from becoming a perfect place. And of course, Jews have often been used as that scapegoat, and they still are for many people. And going back to Pat, you said that very often in your field, it's a bunch of nerdy Jews and a bunch of nerdy Asians. And I think both Asians and Jews present special problems for the isms that insist that racism is the cause of all failures to thrive and all bad outcomes. It can only be racism if groups disproportionately fail to make it in certain areas. If women don't constitute 50% of the CEOs, then it's misogyny that is keeping them out. There can be no other explanation. And so both Jews and Asians have done very well in academia, and not just in science, but in other fields as well. And in the old days, Jews then had there were quotas on Jews, and mostly they were concerned about it being a social invasion, you know, and they didn't want the social character of the universities to change, and the Jews did change the social character. There's no question about it. But and now it's the Asians that are succeeding. But the problem with the Asians is that they have brown skin. I mean, Asians is a big word. It incorporates so many different, it seems like a silly way to, you know, such a huge bunch of people. But in terms of people from India, Pakistan, you know, South Asians, they're doing and Chinese and Japanese, they're doing spectacularly well. And yet they are people of color. And this is a serious problem for the anti-racists, because, but of course the Jews are very successful too, but they're white. But now the Jews have been made to be hyper white. In fact,
Jews
they're
are
so white,
except when they're not.
Except when they're not, right. If you're on the far right, you can just hate Jews because they're not white. They're not white enough, you know. But for the left, they're hyper white, and that is a word that was used in a recent article by Pamela Paresky in a new online journal called Sapir. And it was she made a wonderful case for the fact that now, you know, there have been flyers on college campuses saying, if you want to end white privilege, you have to start by ending Jewish privilege.
Mhm.
And there's this idea that Jews succeeded because of their white privilege. They took advantage of their whiteness to step over, you know, other people to get to where they were. And I really have to mention, because it's been on my mind. I just wrote about it for a publication, and it knocked me out. And I don't know why it didn't get publicity more than it did, but Randy Weingarten, you know, who is the head of the American Federation of Teachers, which is one of the most powerful unions ever. And she's, of course, Jewish. She's lesbian, married to a rabbi, considers herself very Jewish. This is what I'm talking about, the progressive Jews that don't have a clue what they are enabling. And she said a group of Jews were prominent amongst people who were criticizing her for insisting that remote learning in the classroom continue, even though the CDC had said it was no longer necessary. And she singled out the Jewish critics. And she said, I have something to say to my Jewish critics. She said, you are part of the ownership class. She said, and you were immigrants who needed public education and you got it. And now you are pulling the ladder up behind you for other disadvantaged people, not her exact words, but she used that word, pulling the ladder up, like either. And I was so incensed by when I heard her say the ownership class, I actually got a chill down my spine because I, like in my head, I was going kulaks, kulaks, you know, like, and when she said pull the ladder up, what the heck? She was really saying Jews did not merit their success. They did not earn their success. There is no explanation for their success except that they are oppressive, that they stole the.
Oh, they band together too, Barbara.
Oh, there's that too.
You bet. They band together.
Yeah, and I wanted also to say, I forgot to say it last time when I was talking about people who can only see threats to Jews on the right. Progressives like Randi Weingarten can't see that the progressives that she is so eager to be and virtue signaling for is formed the Red-Green Alliance. It's the progressives who have enabled Islamism to become the cause célèbre, this Free Palestine movement, which literally means, translated means, eradicate the Jews from the Middle East, like they have been from every other Arab country and every other region. So it's actually an eradicationist, and so is BDS. And yet you still get 70% of all these smart Jews, you know, they're all university professors and everything else. 70% of them continue to vote left because they think that's where their support and that's where they're safe, is where they're very unsafe. And I think Randi Weingarten stands for, she's not an outlier. She stands for the idiocy of leftist Jews, and most Jews that are not ultra-Orthodox are quite left because they're bleeding. I mean, I shouldn't say they're bleeding hearts. They've always been involved because of their past of persecution, have always been involved, whether it's justice movements, social justice movements, civil rights movements, feminists, I mean, whatever is considered to be the liberating and the fair and the just and the compassionate. And yes, they've been involved in utopian, sorry for my rant. This is painful for me. Maybe Gad for you too. I don't know. Anyways,
it's painful for all of us.
Well, thank you.
This happening, you know.
Thank you. Well, what's painful is that it goes unnoticed. Is that it goes unnoticed amongst Jews. It goes unnoticed, for example, that the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is formed to combat hate in society and to educate school kids and the public on hate, will not stand up for Jews who have been attacked by or involved in any hate incidents unless the hatred comes from the far right. They have never, when it comes to Muslims attacking Jews, they are stumm, and they admit it, and they say, no, the greatest threat is from white supremacists, and they don't see it, they don't want to know about it, and they don't want to hear about it.
There's nothing more annoying than a successful minority, you know.
Yeah, that is annoying, because then you have to admit, well, if they're not oppressors, there's only one other explanation.
Yeah, that's right.
They did it.
That's exactly
They overcame adversity and got to where they went through their own agency, and they decided they weren't going to be victims, and they took whatever opportunities they did have, and they created their own.
And you could say the same about the Indians and the Asians.
Exactly. So now they have a problem.
They're next on the transformation into white.
There's definitely there's quite a bit of discussion about that, and I'm glad to see myself
adjacent white. You're adjacent.
Finally, Asians, whether South Asians or East Asians, Asians in general, are finally actually doing the great American enterprise of lawsuits, because that's how you can make these changes. And I don't know how it works in Canada, but at least the great American enterprise of lawsuits and civil is how you can get civil rights enacted. And I
didn't overthrow the Ivy League it didn't overthrow the Ivy League application process debacle, though, you know, where
It's a,
Asians are just
there's
constantly.
cracks. The velociraptors are testing the gates, is what I would say. And at some point, the velociraptors will break through those gates eventually. So with that, Jordan, let me ask you this, going on from one of Janice's points about genderism and feminism, from your view in psychology and psychiatry and your study of the human behavior, I thought we're supposed to have this fundamental bias for human males, and we live in a patriarchy, and we have everything handed to us on a silver platter. Why is it that somehow that we can have in a university a Department of Women's Studies, we can have a phrase, violence against women, we can have something called rape culture, we can have all these things in which supposedly a group of people who is put down upon seemingly are given all these privileges? How do you reconcile this?
Well, I mean, some of it's inevitable. The universities have opened up to women, and so that's going to cause all sorts of noise as we adjust to it. And the universities, the cultures which in Western universities operate have become more ethnically diverse. And so that also, it's difficult, right? It's difficult for the genders to operate in a new manner, the sexes to operate in a new manner. It's difficult for people to integrate across cultures. And so a fair bit of what we're seeing is noise in the system. You know, you can see, at least to some degree, why there might have been justification for something like women's studies in 1965, when women were a distinct minority. And it was people trying to work out how to do this integration. I mean, it wasn't even an issue until we had reliable birth control and various other technologies that enabled women to participate more broadly in society. And, you know, thank God for that, because we could use the brain power. So some of it's noise. And you know, it's hard for us to see that because our time scale is so short. You know, it's one lifetime. And we're in the midst of this massive experiment. We've transformed the nature of women biologically with it in an unbelievably radical way in like 3 generations. And the transformations have been immense. And a lot of this is, you know, steam boiling off the edges. And that doesn't make it any less dangerous. But, you know, it would have been ridiculous to have men's studies in 1963 because the entire university system essentially was male. So I'm not justifying it. I still think it was a mistake, but it's understandable. So many of these things are somewhat understandable.
When I first heard of women's studies as an undergraduate in 1988, 1990, I also heard about African American studies and all these other fields that ended with studies that seemed to imply that you must buy into some ism. Certainly as a scientist, I didn't like that. And certainly as an atheist, I didn't like that. I didn't want to have anything pushed down upon me. And now having been a citizen of 3 countries, I didn't want to pledge fealty to anything. So what it seems like is we're having some pledging of fealty. And what do you think?
Are you asking me specifically?
Oh, what are you thinking, Jordan? Yes, pledging of fealty.
Well, I mean, the university has been overtaken by second-rate administrators who have a pathological ideological agenda. They're jealous of the hyper specialists like you and their, specialized knowledge. I saw that on ethics committees all the time, where the community member would often block scientific enterprises. They have just as much say in your research as you do, so to speak, despite the fact they don't have a PhD and haven't done their research, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of it's envy, and it's another inversion. And it's an administrative inversion in this case. And faculty members in many ways are to blame for it. I was aghast constantly in my own university at the lack of self-protective ability of my faculty peers. The administration would push us in one direction, and all we would have had to do as a group was say, no. And they would have backed off instantly. And we never did, ever. It was, well, if you don't give them what they want, you won't get anything. It's like, well, we're not getting anything anyways. Have you noticed that? And the number of full-time faculty as a percentage of total faculty is declining every year. And there's more and more students to faculty, et cetera, et cetera. As, weakness.
I will say that you're right that most faculty don't really stand up. And I think
Jesus.
The vast majority, people like yourselves are making it safer for others to stand up. I'm trying to do that within my cohort at McGill and also my cohort of scientists broadly throughout my network of
And are you having any luck? How's that going?
I think it actually goes pretty well. And for example, in several of our departments in McGill, we have pledges of allegiance to diversity, inclusion, and equity, value statements, statements of belief.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought to myself, as a kid, I refused to pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States just because I didn't want to pledge allegiance to anything. Unsurprisingly, I became an atheist scientist. But I'm not going to go around pledging allegiance to things very serious, like the Constitution of the United States. Why am I going to pledge allegiance to something that some diversicrat just made up last week? Because
yeah, and can you get a research grant without submitting your diversity, inclusivity, and equity proposal?
Right
No,
now,
exactly.
you cannot get a research grant without writing a statement of diversity. And I actually was a proof positive that you can lose research funding by not writing a good statement of diversity.
So why don't
They didn't
all the
even look
academics
at
stand
my
up?
scientific quality. They just said your diversity quality wasn't good.
Yeah.
And obviously, not, reflecting upon myself, my own individual background throughout the world, my lab looking like the model United Nations, it's hilarious. I'm sure that we can gauge the composition of whoever made that decision, but nonetheless, it tells you how far we've come, and they're coming for us.
Yeah, but it also tells you how weak we are. Look, if the researchers in Canada, for example, would stand up and say, we're not writing your goddamn diversity, inclusivity, and equity propaganda, go to hell. It would go away now. And so what'll happen is, first of all, you'll write the diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement. And then the next thing will be, if your research isn't about that, you won't get a grant. And that's coming just as sure as can be.
Yeah.
How could it possibly be otherwise?
And so that leads to the notion, I think, that it isn't just the envy of the lesser, intellectually equipped of the brilliant specialists like Pat, because even the brilliant specialists are somehow not able to mount a resistance to die. And I remember, in Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, he talks about the great loss of faith that took place all across the universities, mainly, I guess, in the humanities and social sciences at that time. He's talking about the 60s. He was writing in the 1980s, but looking back to the 60s. But it's happened in the sciences too now, where it's as if even the brilliant researchers themselves no longer had the faith that what they were doing was important enough to defend. It's quite a startling thing that happened, and it happened very quickly, at least according to Bloom. I mean, I wasn't in the university then in the late 60s, but I mean, he describes it happening, within a year or something, that as soon as there was a challenge, as soon as the Black Panthers came onto campus with guns, the university administrators caved to them. And there was just that collapse all across, especially the soft disciplines, with the scientists thinking that they would be spared somehow, so let the social justice initiatives, take over all of these other disciplines, we'll be safe. But then, of course, that didn't happen. Nobody is safe. And I think it also leads to this thought that maybe, like when I was talking about animus and the deep hatred, the murderous fury that is part of these social justice ideologies, it isn't just the fury of the individual who finds that he's given permission, or she, to hate, but that there's a kind of admiration of the hatred on the part of those who witness it. And even maybe
Looks like conviction.
Yeah, it looks like conviction. Well, it is conviction. And it's very attractive. As I think you said, Jordan, that there's a romance about it. Because, there were people who went to the Soviet Union, even back in the 1930s, and they saw that it was horrible. They saw that people were dying, and yet they lied about it. And that's always been the case, that Westerners have gone to these totalitarian societies and they've seen that it's nothing like the utopian place of possibility and equality. And yet that doesn't seem to matter, that merely the conviction and maybe even the murderous hatred itself is attractive to a lot of people.
and they up the ante.
Janice,
So
what? Oh,
when
sorry,
one
go ahead.
person does something, there's kind of a competition to up the ante and what the next one will do.
Janice, what did the feminists tell themselves? There's two things I don't understand about feminists. One is their alliance, their alliance with, standing up for the hijab and the niqab and saying that this is part of being a feminist, is asserting your right to be submissive and all that jazz. And the other thing I don't understand, truly don't understand, is the total submission of most feminists to the trans activists who are out, and also the gay people. I don't understand how feminists, gays, and lesbians can be allying themselves.
I think
with
feminism
trans activism
that on that with social constructivism. It opened the door to this idea that you could be whatever gender you say you are, and then they ended up letting people with penises running feminism in effect.
Yeah, but don't they see they're being erased?
It's not even, I think it's because at base, radical feminism, I mean, obviously there are the trans exclusionary feminists and, so there are these divisions within feminism, but I think what it is that at base, most feminist ideologues don't really care about women. It's about ideological purity. And it's about being able to claim that self-righteous outrage. And it's about being part of the system and directing your rage towards the West and, Western white men as the privileged oppressors. And it isn't really about the treatment of women or even about individual women being able to pursue their choices or to control their destinies. It really is about ideological purity. And I think that we saw that started happening in the 1970s when Marxist feminism and intersectional feminism and the adulation of racialized others and their greater victimization and the demand that white women renounce capitalist, patriarchal imperialism, and in fact, renounce white men and renounce the societies that white men had created in favor of societies that were demonstrably more brutal to women, but which they were able to prove their ideological purity by deferring to and apologizing to.
It speaks to your issue with hatred, Janice, too. It's like, if the fundamental target is the Western patriarchy, then the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes.
And so then you see the true motivation. It's like, well, what about the totalitarian regimes in the rest of the world? Well, as long as they're allied against the patriarchal West, then they're on our side, because when the chips come down, that tells you what our side is.
Yeah.
The question is, like, this animus, what is motivating it? Like, what's the hatred? What's it springing from?
Yeah, I know.
I think hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And I think sometimes, I don't know how much of this is rooted in rejection or bad relationships with men throughout the entire life course, or because there's this presumption that the paternal figure is a patriarchal tyrant, and that fundamentally characterizes the West. It's like,
it's hard to say, but I think, it comes back to the question about the relationship between social justice ideology and religion, because I think there are many people who hold their identity as woke warriors against, the oppressive West. They hold that so close that they would actually rather die than admit that they're wrong. Right. And that's the fundamental thing about an ideology that's all encompassing, that you would endure anything and you would close your eyes to it, even the brutalization of the group that you supposedly represent, even the death of your own family, your own immiseration or whatever it happens to be. You would rather see all of that than give up the ideology that informs you and gives your life meaning. I mean, we've seen that with Solzhenitsyn, for example.
Janice, I think you're right that it's a question of ideology, and that's what is blinding us. And that's why we're all coming back to the same theme of isms and ideologies and schools of thought. And when I was an undergrad in 1990, I wanted to read Bertrand Russell when I entered college, outside of doing my science. Instead, the assigned reading was something about, an indigenous person suffering. And I thought, I don't want to read about anyone suffering. I want to suffer through Bertrand Russell. If I'm not doing that, I'm suffering through quantum mechanics and thermodynamics. And I wanted to suffer through my academia. And I don't want to hear about someone's pain. And this is where I first heard about these things called women's studies and gender studies and African American studies. I coined the term academic Balkanism as an undergraduate myself, thinking this just doesn't look like it's going to go well. And it was happening about the time of the Balkan Wars in the late 80s. So we were talking about academic Balkanization. And instead of having the great ideas of university, or I remember at some point seeing a discussion panel held at McGill where a professor was saying, shouldn't we be speaking truth to power? And I remember thinking, no, we shouldn't be speaking truth to power. We should be speaking truth. I mean, not that it exists. As a scientist, I don't believe truth exists, but nonetheless, we try to get the best accurate representation of truth, nature, whatever we can, the human condition. We're trying to expose our understanding of nature and the human condition. We're not trying to speak truth to power. If you have power, good for you. God bless and go forth and prosper. I would like to have more power myself, but shouldn't we just be trying to speak truth? So I think maybe let me ask Jordan what he thinks about this.
I don't know if I have a specific thought about that.
Here's the reason I get to this. Why are we so in academia this way? We want to signal our virtue. We want to be good. We want to be important. In a different era, we wanted to be gatekeepers of knowledge. Now we're no longer gatekeepers of knowledge. We are instead
critical theory.
There's only so much
we're activists, and we're trying to speak truth to power, and thereby we make ourselves feel important. That's why we're doing what we're doing in academia, and that's why we're leading the West astray. That's not a question. That's my non-experts read on things. I'm curious what you think, Jordan. Then we'll go down our committee here.
Well, I think there's only so much you can ask of people in some sense. It's like, you're a physicist. Okay, so I come up to you and I say, justify the patriarchal institution of marriage. It's like, well, what the hell do you know about it? It's like, you don't know how to justify that. Justify capitalism. It's like, no one knows how to justify anything that everyone takes for granted as a good. And so we push people into corners and we ask them these like unbelievably provocative questions, and they're taken aback, and, they scuttle off to their labs, and that's good because that's what they're supposed to be doing. You have to be unbelievably trained in some sense to participate in this discussion in a public forum. There's so many things you have to know to not look like an utter fool. And you have to be fast on your feet, and you have to be political in nature, and you have to be tested by conflict. And like, I don't know why we would expect to find people like that in universities, like any more than anywhere else, just because they're smart. So it's just asking too much. I don't think that's an excuse in some sense, because, I think every single scientist who pens a diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement in their grant is a traitor. That's what I really think. It's like, you guys are digging your own graves. You don't realize it. And that's because you don't want to, in part, but it's also extremely complicated. So no, you shouldn't be speaking truth to power. You should be in your damn lab. But now and then you have to come out because, the barbarians are at the gate.
Barbarians are at the gate. Curt, let me ask you a question here, and this parlays to one of the questions you raised in your film. It seems somehow easy to point the finger at extremists in the right wing when it seems hard to point the extremists in the left wing, because the left wing makes it sound so nice. Why is that? What's the branding issue, for example?
It's not just that it sounds so nice, because well, they've also redefined words like racism and sexism. And
you said it, Curt. There's a lot of philosophical weight behind the ideas on the left.
It's extremely nuanced. So I'll echo what Jordan said before, which is it does require plenty of thought. And I've studied this for 2 years or so or more. I made a documentary on it, and I still feel like I know 1% of what I should know in order to come to a firm conclusion about almost. Pat, me and you are both mathematically and physically, when I say physically, I mean physics trained. And personally, I find sociology and political science to be far more complex than math and physics, because there are a multitude of variables and a paucity in data, and you can't manipulate populations in the same way. So how the heck are these high schoolers and first years coming to such denouncing so vehemently people? To me, it tells me less about their propositions being true and more that they're motivated by something else. And I don't know what they're motivated by. I did come to some conclusion, which is that it may be related to a societal loss of a myth. Yes. And then something has to be substituted there. But then you ask the question about, is it a religion to be, no, or not to be Petersonian? But then it depends on what you call religion. If a religion is prayer and meditation and a deity, then it's not. But if it's the precepts and dogma,
central axioms,
then it is a religion.
Well, but you laid out some axioms of the West.
Right. And that took quite some time to get to. Yeah. But in major religions, let's say Christianity and Buddhism, there's a huge emphasis on self-directed criticism and never lying. Never lie. And I don't see that with the extreme left or the extreme right. And so in that aspect, they're not religious, but it depends on what one calls religion.
Can I add something, Pat?
Please.
So I often, when I'm discussing truth, I always like to bring out the distinction between deontological systems and consequentialist systems. And I always make the point that it's not that we should be one or the other, it's that we should deploy the right system in the right context. So the example I often like to use is, if your spouse comes to you and says, do I look fat in those jeans? Then you better put on your consequentialist hat really quickly and say, of course you don't. And so even though I might have lied, I saved the long-term stability of my marriage. On the other hand,
Gad, imagine what happens if you're married to an aspie scientist.
On the other hand, when it comes to the pursuit of truth, which ostensibly that's what we should be doing, irrespective of the discipline that we're studying in academia, then you should be deontological in that pursuit. In other words, I never modulate my pursuit of the truth for some consequentialist goal. But that's exactly what happens with activist professors, right? Because what are they saying? They're saying, look, if I study race differences and the results don't come out according to the way that I would have wanted them to come out, then store them away in your file and never show those results. If you're studying sex differences that show that women are superior, then please publish it. You'll be hailed as a great scientist. If it shows that men are superior on some tasks, then you better do away with that. So I think that's where the tension comes in. Once you forego your deontological bent in the pursuit of truth, that's where you get the activist professor, and that's where you get into the problems that we're talking about.
Thank you. Excellent point. Now, then, let's see. Here's a question.
Also, by the way, to get back to another reason why they're not religious is, at least in the Christian story, you're supposed to love your enemy. And even if someone's persecuting you and oppressing you, Jesus healed the ear that was of the person who was about to kill him. And you don't see this love if they're actually driven by compassion. You don't see it. You don't see truth embedded in love. So you don't see truth nor love, or at least I don't.
Indeed.
You don't see forgiveness. You don't see forgiveness. You don't see redemption. You don't see salvation. You don't see any of what's supposed to, I mean, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, these are the features.
There's no redemption for the white male, for example. There's no way to expiate this sin. It can't be forgiven.
That's right.
Yes,
well, that's because there can't expiate
forgiveness and redemption. That's a miraculous idea. You know, the idea that you can do something terrible and then repent and then be accepted. I mean, that's a hell of a revolutionary idea. This is a reversion to, what would you say, I would say this is more of a reversion to standard unsophisticated human behavior, whereas once you're tainted for good, and you're tainted by association too, just like the class traitors, going down 3 generations in places like North Korea. There's no redemption.
Certainly, as someone who studied a number of religions,
Yes.
I would say, but doesn't necessarily practice any one, but I try to learn from them as best I can. And what it seems like the social justice people have done is thrown out the babies of all the various world religions, retained the bathwaters of many. Now, there's a related question that I have, which is in the leftist progressive movements, and I think as Curt has shown in his film, there's a social control quality. Not necessarily, sometimes violence, but before violence, there's social control. And our current modern, what I call the modern Anglophone leftist culture, MAL, MAL, if you're a French speaker or a Spanish speaker, the modern Anglophone leftist culture, and it's not just American, it's Anglophone. This culture seems to be focused on social control practices, to wit, shaming, calling out. Even the phrase calling out seems questionable. And here's another phrase which I find questionable: do better. So shaming, calling out, and do better. To what extent is there a gendered aspect of this culture, and to whom can we assign agency and accountability to the origins of this current culture? And Janice, you're smiling, I'm going to ask you. So what do you think?
Yeah, this was the one.
Sorry, before you answer, Janice, I think we lost Barbara. You might want to look for her to bring her back into the spotlight. She's not in our spotlight.
No.
Okay, good point. Let me see here.
Sorry to interrupt you, Janice.
Yeah, that's fine. No, this is the question I didn't really want to answer anyway. I'll start. I'll make a little stab at answering while we wait for Barbara to come back. I've thought about this a little bit, but I feel embarrassed talking about any such things with people like Jordan and Gad in the conversation. But I think I read somewhere about saying that engaging in relational aggression, sort of indirect aggression, is generally understood as a more feminine strategy. The women sort of, I guess, as a result of our evolutionary biology, we tend to not want to engage in direct combat. And it does seem that there's something to this that's happening in the universities and elsewhere, where you have a lot more gossiping behind the scenes. You have whisper networks taking place, and part of what goes on is reputation destruction and social exclusion. Those are the primary forms, or some primary forms, that are used to discipline those who step out of line and who are deemed irredeemable. It does seem that there's a gendered element to what's going on. It would be a lot clearer, I think, if we engaged one another perhaps more directly. Instead, we have Twitter mobs that form because it's much safer to attack in a mob, and you can attack anonymously. And when that happens, of course, you're not even really dealing with a person. You're just dealing with somebody who has, who you've identified as a threat, who has to be completely excluded, and who is seen as having no morally, redeemable elements. I don't quite understand, all of what's going on in creating this particular kind of indirect or relational aggression, but it certainly does seem to be a primary feature of our age.
Well, we don't have any familiarity with explicit female political behavior because it's new. And if you think there isn't a shadow side of female political behavior, then you're an idiot. So, and this relational or this reputational destruction element of female antisocial behavior is something that no one pays any attention to. Well, it's not surprising either, because it's, in some sense, it's a new phenomenon, isn't it?
It's a new phenomenon to look for it, but interestingly, you'll find out there's someone you might all know yourselves, a professor by the name of Roy Baumeister, who I think is in psychology, and he was at Florida State, now he's in Australia. He had this spectacular book called "Is There Anything Good About Men?" And it's funny because men did obviously all these number of things to create society, But the question is, there's such a now current culture of denigrating man and masculinity. So he raises this rhetorical question and then addresses it in his book. Because we all know how wonderful women are. There's even the psychological idea the women are wonderful effect. So their pain somehow matters more. I think, so anyway, I guess with Roy Baumeister, he has a young student. So unsurprisingly, in psychology, one of his young students is a woman, because as you know, psychology is largely females. Now she's a young assistant professor doing her own research, and her own research is on in-group competition amongst women and how they exhibit their own, tendencies that men would do to ourselves. And certainly myself as this male scientist, there are ways I would act to other male scientists that I wouldn't act to other female scientists, namely to be aggressive in a certain way. Most of the time you like to be a nice guy, but sometimes somebody might bring out your ire. And if you're a man, that ire might come out. I can't imagine that ever coming out to a woman. That would be inconceivable. So tell me what you think, Jordan.
Well, one thing, what do I think about that? I think that,
well, you had
the
mentioned the
proclivity
point where you
that
said males and females can't fight. We don't know how to do that. Males fight each other. We can't fight females.
There's an element of truth in that. It's not easy for men to figure out how to be competitive with women, right? I mean, because if you lose, you're weak, and if you win, you're a bully. It's like, and so I'm not saying that there aren't grounds for negotiation between the sexes. Obviously there is, but it does make the workplace troublesome for everyone in a new way.
Sorry, Art.
No, Gad, please go ahead.
So let me bring it back to evolution. So Darwin talked about natural selection and sexual selection. Sexual selection is the mechanism by which the evolution of traits that could not have conferred a survival advantage evolved, because they confer a mating advantage. Well, sexual selection comes in two types. It either comes through intersexual wooing. So the peacock's tail is the tail evolves to impress the girls, or it comes through intra-sexual competition. The two rams bat their heads together, and the one who wins gets sexual access to all the females. So notice that as a fundamental principle of sexual selection doesn't talk about oppression of one sex to the other, right? So evolutionary mechanisms, by their inherent definition, that, it's not about intersexual competition, it's intrasexual competition, right? So the greatest violence you see, whether it be physical violence or reputational violence or the gossiping or this, the machinations, it's either women on women or men on men. So the actual narrative of, there is this grand patriarchal evil conspiracy to keep women down is perfectly antithetical to the most fundamental of evolutionary mechanisms that create biodiversity. So it's complete hogwash. Men are a lot more violent towards other men than they ever are towards other women. Now, this doesn't mean that men don't behave in nefarious ways to control women's sexuality, right? So there's nothing more threatening in the world as a natural force than women's sexuality. So men come up with all sorts of mechanisms to try to rein in female sexuality. But male to male and female to female intrasexual competition is much greater than intrasexual competition.
Thank you.
Intersexual.
Thank you. Let me see here. Evolutionary psychology, Gad and Jordan. It seems almost a sin to discuss the behavioral implications of biology and evolution via natural selection. Why is this? And what can we do going forward? Do the rules of physics and chemistry also not apply any longer to humans and how we behave in the world? How can medicine work if gender and race are social constructs?
Well,
You
I'll
want me
start
to
with
start
the
or you
first
want
of
to
those.
Go ahead, Jordan.
Well, look, Curt talked about the necessity for us to live in a myth, and he interviewed or had a clip of Marie-Louise von Franz, who's a very, very smart Jungian analyst. Not many Jungians have her credibility. She's a towering intellect, that woman. You know, our myth took a vicious hit because of biological thinking. You know, I believe our Judeo-Christian moral structure is at the basis of our culture, you know, and it's a Nietzschean observation that God died in the late 1800s, and we've been flailing around ever since. And part of what killed God was Darwin, that's for sure. Now, what that's going to mean in the ultimate scheme of things, I don't exactly know. But, you know, whenever we start looking into the realm of deep biology in particular, we still threaten what's left of that myth. And that's a big problem. It's a big problem because, you know, I could say to the atheists among the group, you know, you're not too fond of religion. How are you feeling about its replacement? So, and that's a serious question, man. That's a serious question for everyone, not just for people who profess atheism. It's a serious question.
As an atheist, I'll say I prefer religion.
Yes, well, there are many atheists who are coming to that conclusion. And so, and that begs a kind of question. Well, then the second problem with evolutionary biology is we're not that fond of being like deterministic biological creatures. You know, we do like our freedom, and the idea that our behavior is determined in some sense in the same way that animals' behavior is determined by the forces of natural selection is somewhat off-putting. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who is not offended by something about evolutionary psychology or biology. So, and that's probably, you know, when I was a practicing researcher, I always knew when I discovered something true because I didn't want to believe it. So that's part of the, you know, that's part of the problem. And these are serious problems. I mean, Curt, I thought you did quite a remarkable job at the end of the film when you started to ask the deeper question in some sense, which is, well, what is our culture predicated on? Our functional Judeo-Christian Western culture. I wanted to ask one thing too, it's a bit of a detour, but not too much. What do you guys think about this idea that all these ideas, individuality, liberty, conscientiousness, etc., are Western constructs? Like, I don't think I've ever heard anything more racist in my life than that. That you take the central tenets of Western culture, let's say, and you say, well, those are exclusively Western. I see them as the development of the, what would you say, of the impetus towards freedom that characterizes the entire human race. And I think it's an appalling thing that those are identified with white Europeans.
These are human qualities, and I would say as much as a fan of economics and Milton Friedman, whom I used to study as a kid, capitalism and freedom are fundamentally intertwined. Capitalism is not a straight white male heterosexual patriarchal construct. It's something to which we all aspire that gets us out of poverty. So these are fundamental human things. So Gad, tell us what you're thinking about evolutionary psychology and why are we so against it?
Thank you. So I've argued in several of my works that there are certain cognitive and emotional obstacles that make us innately predisposed to hate evolutionary psychology. So this is sort of a meta explanation, right? There is an adaptive reason why we despise adaptive explanations, right? So I'll just mention, a few. For example, we're very, very bad. And so I'm going to borrow a concept from Richard Dawkins, who talks about middle world, right? So it's very hard for our human brain to understand something at the cosmological level. It just seems too wacky. And I mean, I try to watch sometimes all these physics shows and, I'm lost by the third sentence, right? Not because I'm incapable of complex thought, but because it's hard to try to understand things at this cosmological scale. You put things at the nanoscales, it's very difficult for the human brain to understand. So that's why we've evolved, as Richard Dawkins says, to understand things at middle world. Now take that concept to distal explanations. In other words, is the human mind capable of understanding and explaining something that you're purporting to explain that happened, in the Pleistocene era? Well, for most people, they don't like such things. So already there is this temporal aversion. You weren't there. How do you know that evolution happened this way, Professor? But what do you mean? I mean, how do physicists explain the Big Bang that happened much further back than the evolution of the human mind? So for all sorts of cognitive, emotional, epistemological, ideological reasons, so look at all the cocktail of obstacles I just mentioned, people have a strong aversion to evolutionary thinking, especially when applied to human beings, and especially when applied to human beings above the neck, right? So to study the evolution of our opposable thumbs, oh, sure, that's fine. But to apply to the most important organ of our body, which is that defines our personhood, well, surely you're engaging in quack pseudoscience, Dr. Saad. So I think it's very, very difficult to get people to capitulate to these obstacles, to let go of these obstacles. But ultimately, the only way you're going to have unity of knowledge or consilience in the behavioral sciences is when they are unified under the rubric of evolutionary theory. So in the same way that biologists today, so even if you're operating at the cellular level or molecular level or organism level or population level, everyone is a Darwinist if they are a biologist. We have to get to a stage where all behavioral scientists, irrespective of which type of specialty you come from, you take it for granted that whether you're studying perception or motivation or decision making, you're studying it with the constraint of evolutionary thinking. So I think this will happen maybe in 50 and 100 years. But for now, I think there are too many emotional and cognitive obstacles to overcome.
So it seems. So it seems. Let me ask the final question of the panel here. And I think it's something that actually Jordan really popularized more than anyone, but I think you all are in your own way. We are at a low point for valuing freedom of speech, and something that Jordan distilled for me, which is ultimately a freedom to think. Trace this history in your views, and what are some steps that might be taken to correct this trajectory? Jordan, tell us what you think.
Well, I think there's a revelatory element to thought. So you ask yourself a question and the answer springs out of the void and you think you thought it up, but you didn't really. It appeared in your field of consciousness in some sense. And I mean, people have that intuition when they talk about insight and inspiration. It feels in some sense like something coming in from outside. But then there's a dialogical element to thought, which is associated with critical thinking, where you take the revelatory content and you subject it to an analysis. And basically what you're doing internally, and the Russians, Vygotsky in particular, worked on this idea, is that, critical thinking is internalized dialogue. You have an avatar who stands for one perspective and an avatar who stands for another, or if you're really sophisticated, maybe you have 4 or 5 of them, and they go at it, analyzing the idea. Well, in all likelihood, we learn to do that by modeling external dialogue. And so it could be literally the case that without freedom of speech, there is no freedom of thought. Now, I don't think it's that cut and dried, because even our critical thought is a reflection of our unique experience in combination with everything we've learned. So we bring something to the table that isn't merely interiorized speech. But a lot of it's interiorized speech, unless you think you thought up everything you think, in which case you're a fool. You certainly didn't think up the words you used to think with. Someone else thought those up, like many people. So no free speech, no thought. And then you ask yourself, well, is thought useful? Well, if power is everything, then perhaps thought isn't useful. The question is, why in the world we ever allowed ourselves to even have to defend the notion that power is everything? It's such a pathological, paranoid, appalling, accusatory, shallow, vicious, malevolent idea that it's just stunning to me that we're having this conversation. It's like, really? That's your theory of the civilization of the world? That it's a power-mad,
it would seem to be
patriarchal
based upon
tyrant?
jealousy and envy, in fact, jealousy and envy of those who did create.
Oh, there's definitely plenty of that. And you can understand that. It's like, how many of us aren't jealous of geniuses? I'm no mathematical genius. I'd like to understand quantum physics. I can't understand the mathematics. I'd like to be a great musician. I'm definitely not. it's really easy for that to become envy. You know, and if I can't be who you are, then I can certainly tear you down. That's the story of Cain and Abel, right? It's the most primordial story of actual human beings that we have. Cain and Abel, that's everywhere.
Gad, tell us why we're at such a low point for free speech. And I'm actually daily surprised that you're not canceled yet. I know Michael's been canceled. Jordan's always attempted to be canceled. People are always trying, you know, but not the Gadfather. Why are we at this stage?
I think because we've found a way to delimit what is considered to be free speech. I always like to use the following example, because it is so poignant. I'm Jewish with my own personal history in the Middle East, yet I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their nonsense. That's what free speech absolutism is, right? It basically recognizes that the price you pay for freedom of speech is that you might be exposed to imbeciles, to racists, to idiots, to falsehood spreaders. The problem today is, again, it's because of consequentialism. Please don't speak the truth if it hurts someone's feelings, right? So there isn't this deontological principle, I'm allowed to say whatever I want to say because of the deontological value of freedom of speech. It's a consequentialist calculus. Don't say whatever you have to say. If it hurts someone's, it's hate speech or it's misinformation, right? So we're always finding ways to rein in the absolutism of freedom of speech. So that's why we're in the quagmire. Freedom of speech is everything, right? It literally is. Everything else is details. So until we return to this dogged pursuit and defense of freedom of speech, we're only going to go down this slow train ride to hell.
Very good. Thank you so much. Michael.
And so I look at this from a historical perspective, and I think it's really the key moment is 1965, when Herbert Marcuse wrote his essay, Repressive Tolerance, which openly argued that only leftists should have free speech, and that any speech that was not deemed promoting of liberation should be suppressed. And so what he came down to is that in order to promote tolerance, leftists should practice intolerance toward non-leftist expression. And he even justified the use of force to shut down speech that the left disapproves of. This essay, Repressive Tolerance, became a blueprint for the modern left. This is what they're operating on. This is the playbook. And in order to do something about it, we need to promote classical liberalism. We need to promote open inquiry and debate. We need to create a movement to bring these back about. We have to actually create a counter movement in order to to counter this kind of absolutism on the left, which is shutting down speech altogether, because it isn't just about their feelings. It's also about whether you violate their ideological predispositions. It's whether your views are aligned with their objectives and their agenda. So this has to be countered in an organized fashion, but as individuals, as Jordan pointed out, we really can only be ourselves. And as soon as they shut down that possibility, then we have nobody left. I mean, they're prescribing thoughts, having thoughts dictated to us. You can't think under these terms. So there needs to be a massive reformation of academia in order to return universities to their stated missions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. Janice.
Oh, I don't have much to add, really. I mean, that was a very eloquent 3 statements there. I would just say that I think part of the problem is too that many people are, I mean, freedom is an unusual thing. I think it's Bruce Pardy in the film who talks about how if you look at the whole history of humanity, you know, the period of time in which a large number of people had relative freedom as well as relative security and plenty. It's just a tiny, tiny part of human history. And what I feel now is that many people are actually tired of freedom. I think many people are not really very interested in freedom and find it frightening. or would prefer other things, find security more important. I think we've seen that very powerfully in the last year of COVID hysteria and the organization of hatred against anyone who raised questions about the various Western democracies' response to COVID. I think we do certainly have to make a very strong defense of freedom. And we also have to contend with the fact that not everybody is actually interested in it.
Thank you. And Curt, I guess let me round out with you, because I guess we can call you a millennial. I'm assuming you're a millennial. But how do you think? What's your view of the feelings of your generation, whether the millennials or my own kids' generation? I guess they're called Gen Zs, in regards to freedom versus safety, and why is it so hard for people to make a defense of free speech and classical liberal principles that your film deals with? So we came with your film. Let's wrap up with your film. Why is it so hard to defend classical liberal principles and free speech?
Well, to go back to what Gad said about consequentialism, I was with someone who self-identifies as being a part of the radical left, so I'm not demeaning her by saying this. I was walking with her and there was a dog on the street. I think it was one of the brighter breeds of the dogs, let's say. And I remember saying that this breed is known for its intelligence. And then she said, no, it's all dogs have the same intelligence. And then I was thinking, why would she say such an absurd statement? And then the reason is, okay, because if dogs can differ in their IQ based on some genetic quality, then we can trace that back. Maybe humans can, and then that can justify race and IQ. So they work backward to come up with their truth. And it's almost like they think, what will a stereotypical member of the Westboro Baptist Church think? And if they like this idea, then it's a false idea. And right. I see this in my generation. I see this, but not all. I see this in the most noisy part of my generation. And I also think that when they say this, they don't believe it. There's a part of them that doesn't believe it, that they're just told it and they feel like it has to be right. And maybe they feel like there's some censor. There's some part of them that is judging them if they don't act in accordance with what their queer studies or gender studies or whatever the grievance studies professors have told them. I think they feel some guilt about that. And what else? I also wanted to ask, if people like the film, hopefully you did, if you like the film, please do share it on Twitter and Facebook. And the reason is that we've been banned from Twitter and Facebook and YouTube ads. I'm not sure what the current status is because I'm not in charge of the marketing, but it's so greatly hurt its distribution. So please do, if you can, if you like it, share it. Even if you don't like it, share it and say why you don't like it.
I like
it. I like
a link that's the best for that.
Sure, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
I'll say right now, betterleftunsaidfilm.com or the trailer, which I'll send. But betterleftunsaidfilm.com, if people buy it from there, you also get access to the director's cut, which is a longer version and has your colleague, Peterson, your John Vervaeke colleague, your close friend, and Pajot is in it. Pajot had to be cut for the public version, unfortunately. But it has a longer chapter 4, which is the more mythological section, the one that I like the most. And I get into a case as to why I think lying in particular, more than truth-telling, because truth-telling is actually extremely, extremely difficult. But lying, you can identify when you're lying. And it's more, I would say it's more powerful to cease lies than it is to tell the truth, because you're motivated to tell you're motivated to think what you're saying is the truth.
Well, Curt, thank you. And thank you all to the panel. I wish Barbara were here. I think she must have been cut off in some manner. We lost her along the way. For my purposes, being in physical sciences, it has given me great pleasure to see the likes of you all rise up since 2014 and be able to defend classical liberal principles and the functioning of the university. My hope is that with this panel discussion and with the film that Curt made, it shows that there's more appetite for these sort of things, whether in the university or whether with the general public, the civilians, and hopefully the youth. I think the youth, and speaking for my own youth that are probably home right now, hopefully watching a Jordan Peterson or Gad Saad video themselves, they're learning, and they don't trust the university cultural environment. They're learning from YouTube. And I think smart young Gen Z kids are waking up, and I think that they will hopefully have some good things to add to this discussion in the coming decades or so. So to all those who were able to join us online on Zoom, thank you very much. And this video will of course be uploaded on YouTube later. And thank you to the panel for joining us, and thank you all.
Pat, you did a
Thank you,
wonderful job,
Pat.
man. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
I
much.
appreciate
See
you
all you people.
organizing this. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
What a